a different story.
You got to be careful. All right, I'll start off with a disclaimer. As everybody starts,
Yes.
the disclaimer is I'm sharing information which um, I've learned from my teachers, and it's not my original thoughts. Obviously, it isn't even their original thoughts. I mean, some of it are their original thoughts, meaning some of their footnotes. I'm very meticulous at note taking. I've learned to become very meticulous. Why? Because you get better marks. I discovered almost 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, when I started the course, I did the first course, and I was scribbling my. Did I tell you this story? I was scribbling in the sidebars my notes, and as the rabbis were talking, and I was scribbling in the sidebars, all of a sudden, one of the rabbis said, "Next week I'm going to hand out the midterm." I didn't even know there's exams, So I'm looking at these scribbling, and I'm saying, "How am I gonna?" It's an open book, but you got to be able to find the sources. You have to know where to look for things. How do you do it? So Laura said to me, because she's meticulous, "Your notes stink." And that's not the way you take notes, and you have to learn how to really be serious. So I got organized. I started to organize and compile and become very serious at my note taking, and then all of a sudden my marks went from B's to A's. So it works, Dr. Schimmer. Like if you, I guess you probably taught some of your students that if you work hard, I guess you can do better. Anyway, um, so what I'm doing is I'm sharing what the poskim teach us. A posek is not just a decider of Jewish law necessarily. A posek is also someone who is an expert, if you will, at that subject, meaning he's an authority. Not everybody can be an authority on everything. I'm an authority on nothing, but I'm a good note taker. So I'm able to share with you what I've learned. And what I find fascinating is not necessarily just the material or the leniencies or the strict positions that rabbis take, but the how they come to their conclusions. It's like long division. When you're doing long division and you're working it out, the teacher doesn't just care about the answer. He wants to see how you arrived at it. How did you get to the answer? When you see the work, then you start to, the process starts to become clearer to you. And we get to know the methodology of different rabbis. So every rabbi has their own method of thinking. They're very similar. They follow along the lines of, we know who, the Rambam mostly. Rambam wrote Yad Chazakah. He wrote a set of volumes which we know as the Mishnah Torah. And the Rambam is Maimonides, if some of you don't know. And when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he wrote it as a code of laws that we should follow. So does anybody doing Daf Yomi here? Is anybody following every day the Daf of the page? So if you're not, I don't do Daf Yomi. I like to learn law. So I take the laws, I go to the Gemara, and I see what the Gemara says on it. Then from the Gemara, I go to the Shulchan Aruch, which is Rav Yosef Karo, and I see what Yosef Karo says on it. Inside of that, you can see what the Shach and the Taz say, and you can see what the Ramah says. And the Ramah's Rav Moshe Isserlis, and he gives us an Ashkenazi opinion. And then we go to the modern poskim. When I say modern, I mean from the 80s, the 90s, even now. And we see what they say, how things have changed, how things developed. And one of the things that I find fascinating for myself is the differences in their methodology, even though we're all following the thinking of the Rambam originally, which, by the way, when he said to, and I told this before, follow my books. You don't need to study the Gemara. You don't need to follow it's too hard. It's too difficult. Just do what I say. Here's the book. It tells you don't flip a light on Shabbos. Don't flip a light on Shabbos. Don't have this on Pesach. Don't do it. But as Jews, we always look for ways to get around the laws. How can we get around the laws? So we all think we're going to learn something fresh from the Gemara, and often we go in full circle. We don't really learn anything fresh. we learn about one rabbi somewhere that came up with a lenient opinion that said you can do this. Are we allowed to follow that one lenient opinion of one rabbi if the majority say you can or you can't do something? One lone rabbi, is he allowed to be followed by us? And the answer is maybe. In some cases, yes. In some cases, absolutely not. We're not supposed to stand out, which means a good rabbi, they're all good, but a good rabbi should say to his flock, you know, the best thing to do is to follow what the majority opinion is. Let's do what the Yidden do. Let's do what the Jews mostly do. Let's not just have our own opinion. A perfect example is in the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura interprets laws. And the Mishnah Brura says, on Rosh Hashanah, some believe that you can do tashlich, you know, the act of tashlich, throwing away your sins. You have to do it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Everybody knows that. Well, you don't have to do it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. You have to do it before Hoshana Rabbah. So even if you missed it for whatever reason, bad weather, you weren't feeling well, you couldn't go, it's almost like a Pesach Sheni. You can go by the stream or the river, wherever it is you go, and do that act and say that prayer anytime up until Hoshana Rabbah. That's a beautiful thing. So I've seen people, I've done it myself after, you can do it before Hoshana Rabbah. So, but it's preferable. It's preferable to do it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. What happens if Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat? We're not allowed to cast away our sins and do that act on Shabbat. It's a violation. It's something we're not supposed to do. It's a secondary violation. It's not a Torah. It's not a Torah violation, but it's a rabbinic violation. Well, there's one obscure rabbi that says, even on Shabbat, I think you should go and you should do it. So is it preferable to say he thinks you're racing to do the mitzvah of tashlich, that we should go and do it if every other rabbi says don't do it? I think you're better off to following. So often the poskim, these authorities, these rabbis will say, Yesh alma lismoch. You have something to rely upon at least. You have something to be happy about if you do that. And they say, if you want to be so strict about that, you be strict. You know, we'll get to it one day. We're going to go through, we're finishing technology today. We're going to go into medical ethics. And then from medical ethics, someday in the future, we'll come back to kashrut and we'll talk about Shabbat and kashrut and all of those rules. It's fascinating. You know, you're not allowed to peel certain things on Shabbat. It's a Torah violation to separate. Did you know that? Separating on Shabbat is a violation. It's a Torah violation because of the field, because in the farmers, you weren't allowed to take, to be choosing and selecting certain things on Shabbat. So what about an apple peel? You know, you want to peel an apple. You don't like the peel of an apple. Are you allowed to use a regular, ordinary peeler to do that if it's an everyday utensil? Some rabbis say, no, you shouldn't use an apple peeler. You should use a knife to do it, so to show it's different. If you have to do it, then at least use a knife. Because you wouldn't normally peel an apple with a knife. You would use your peeler, so do something with a shinui. Do something different. So we're all about finding the loophole. Well, this is the last class today on the topic that we're going to talk today. It's not the last class that you'll ever hear. I'm sure now you're going to want to delve into it yourself, but it's the last class that I'm going to give on this idea of in vitro or artificial insemination. And before we start, I'll just say, you know, Esther's dad's yurtzeit is today. It's Solomon Meisel's yurtzeit. And I knew Saul. I never knew Esther. I got to meet Esther. Unfortunately, she reminded me today, the first time I met Esther was at her father's funeral. I remember your mother's funeral was a rainstorm. We couldn't even be outside. It was lightning coming down, and I remember that for some reason. But your father's funeral, I went, oh, this is Saul's daughter. I'd never met you, but I knew your father for, I don't know, 25 years because he studied at a chavruta, in two chavrutas actually. He studied in one at Bet David, but he also studied at Beth Emeth. In the library, Leon Eisner, Moshe Gruda, Harry Kaplan, Solomon Meisels, and Cy Loomer, my father, were a group that would study together and learn. And Saul and Moshe Gruda would go at loggerheads. They'd argue about everything, I think. So in honor of your father, we'll do a little bit of arguing today. So we talked about all of the strict opinions that were against artificial insemination. Why? Because they were saying, you know what? It's not something we should be doing, because how do we know if it's really going to be the child of that person, and he fertilized us an egg, and now we have a child, and who's the halachic father, and we don't know if it's the halachic father. And don't forget, we didn't have DNA back in those days. They didn't have DNA. We couldn't do that kind of testing. And then they said, you know, it's a real problem, because if somebody's donating their sperm so other people can have babies, and he donates the sperm to someone in Hamilton and to somebody in Guelph, Ontario, and those two children meet at a B'nai B'rith dance and they get married, is that considered incest? And then we had the other idea of what happens about the father vamooses. He goes for a pack of cigarettes and never comes back. And he says, you know what, I don't want to be responsible. I'm not responsible. They're not mine. I'm not even going to leave them anything in inheritances. Is there the mitzvah of pru-urvu, which is being fruitful and multiply? Is there a mitzvah of kabed av ve'imecha, honor your father and your mother? Now, just a minute, those are two very serious mitzvot. Pru-urvu, the first mitzvah of the Torah, honor your father and your mother, is in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the Ten Commandments. These are not like fluffy, bring your korban chatat and it has to be a pure goat and the goat had a blemish on it. This is serious. And then there was the third issue of inheritance. Inheritance in the Talmud is very serious. They talk about inheritances for Gemaras. You have to be fair. You have to be fair. You have to leave something to these, if you have what to leave. I'm going to spend all the inheritances, so nobody will have anything. But for some people who want to leave something. Anyway, and I'm kidding about that too. So in establishing paternity in cases where in vitro fertilization and artificial insemination are concerned, we're going to now, we've looked at all of these ancient sources. We're going to come right down to the 1980s. All right, the 80s, if this was 1987, you'd say, ooh, it's yesterday. When I say the 80s, you're thinking, that's so long ago. It's 45 years ago, 40, you know, and to me, it doesn't seem like 45 years ago. But when we talk about the 1980s in terms of halacha, Jewish law, believe me, that's yesterday. Compared to when I quote something from the 12th century, the 1980s is yesterday. But even past the 1980s, into the 90s, and the early 2000s, we have opinions to rely upon. So let's see what Moshe Feinstein, great halachic authority, lived in New York, I believe. Was he in Brooklyn or Manhattan? I can't remember. I think it was in Manhattan. And everybody would line up and come to him for shilas and questions and issues revolving what's fair, who should be paying who what. It was a constant stream of traffic all day long, and he lived in a very, very modest apartment. So you would have to line up all the way down the stairs of the building. Imagine living on the second floor and he's on the third floor, and you have this constant flow of like people. I guess it was an honor to live in the same building as Rav Moshe Feinstein, but it'd be a constant staircase lined up with people waiting to come and see him. So Moshe Feinstein says, okay, we know about the mitzvah of pru-urvu, of being fruitful and multiplying in the Torah. He said, but it's not only in the hands of the man or the woman. We think of it, it's something that they made a decision. It's not only in their hands, but it's also in the hands of God. That's a very interesting concept. I always say to a couple when I'm doing a wedding for, I say, you're going to have one partner in your marriage. And they get scared because they're thinking I might say it's the father-in-law or the mother-in-law or it's not. The partner is God. Symbolically, the chuppah, when you stand under the very first Jewish home, you are, it's all open. It's open because all of those invited guests that are behind you, they're being invited to come into your first Jewish home. And it's because God's there in the presence. We're saying brachot, and it's a blessing, and God should shine upon a new couple getting married. It's what you accept. So the act of pru or vu is considered an act of marital intercourse, Rav Moshe Feinstein said. Whether or not, I have to use this language because it's a class of adults, whether or not there's ejaculation or not. It doesn't, he said it doesn't matter. If a couple are together and they're intimate, let's forget about that ejaculation. Forget about it for a minute. Pretend that it happened, it didn't happen, we don't know. In other words, what Moshe Feinstein's saying is there's a partner in the intimacy, and the partner is God. Some people have children, some people don't have children, some people don't want children, some people would love to have children, some people are not blessed with children, some people don't want to adopt, some people do want to adopt, some people inherit children from marriages like I did. Every case is different. And yet, just that act, he said, of sexual intercourse, that act is the act of pru or vu according to Moshe Feinstein. Well, that's interesting. So he's not saying having a child is the act. And interestingly, who does that mitzvah fall upon? Does it fall upon the man? Does it fall upon the woman? Does it fall upon both? And what happens if it's a woman married to a woman or a man married to a man in a gay relationship? Who has the burden of producing? Who does that fall upon? Does anybody know? Would anybody want to take a guess? Somebody knows.
In the old times, was it not considered the woman? Because she got blamed for everything anyway. If you didn't have a male child, if you didn't have any children.
Well, according to Henry VIII, he just had them killed. Right? He just said, you know what, it's enough. And Boleyn, goodbye, Charlie. So I think it was, so Isaac says it's God's burden. God's burden. That's very interesting. Okay.
I thought it was the man.
What?
I thought it was the man's responsibility.
You're right. So Dr. Schimmer's right. So it's the man. It's the man's responsibility. And that's why when the Torah says something that is extremely controversial, like in the last Parsha, and then we hear it again on Yom Kippur, about the line about a man should not lie with a man. Understand that the Torah, we have people even on our own ritual committees that would like to say, we're not reading that line of Torah, we're going to dissolve that line of Torah, we're not going to read it. It shouldn't be read. It's the terrible thing to say that, and we're not going to say it. I say the contrary. And I'm speaking as the father of at least one gay child. Okay? So I can tell you right now, it's the opposite. I believe you should read it. You're going to say, Marshall's Beshiga. What's he saying that for? Well, because according to what Dr. Schimmer says, according to what Bernie says, when he says it's the obligation for the man, that's why the Torah does not allow serus. It does not allow castration to a man. Oh, now we're going to be getting into some medical ethics. We're going to cross the line very, very soon. Does not allow castration. The Torah does not allow it. By the way, it doesn't allow it for a man, it doesn't allow it for your donkey, it doesn't allow it for your horse, it doesn't allow it for your cat or your dog. How many of us have neutered our animals, our dogs and our cats because we want to keep me? I have. It's forbidden. It's asur, it's a midoraisa. We have performed a Torah violation by doing so, and really in the old days we would have had lashes or we'd have had to bring a korban chatat. All right. So let me interpret my version of what I think that sentence really means when they say a man and a man. What they're saying is that, first of all, we're not Torah Jews. So everything we read in the Torah is not what we follow. So why pick on that one verse when we don't follow so many of the other verses? We cheat on our taxes. We're not supposed to steal, but we do. How come we don't pick on that verse? Let's not read that verse. How about we shouldn't murder, yet we speak Lashon Hara and we murder people's reputations? That's a Torah violation. How about people that commit adultery? Don't say this, but that you can do. Or how about we violate Shabbat on the Torah level every single Shabbat? On the Torah level, not the second, on the main, on what we call your chayav, an av malacha. You got 39 violations we can't do, and a lot of us break many of those 39 violations every Shabbat. Punishable. But for that one Torah, let's take a look at it. It doesn't say anything that a woman shouldn't lie with a woman. How come? Why does it only say a man and a man? Because if the Torah permitted that, this is before we had in vitro, many years ago, think about where we'd be. The men would rather be with the men. I want to be with the men. I can go to a baseball game with the men. I can have a corned beef sandwich with the men. The women, you know what? They want a salad. I don't want a salad. I want a knish and a corned beef sandwich. And I want to talk like baseball, and I want to, so I believe men like men company. And I have something to tell you. Believe it or not, I watch dynamics of people. Women like women company. That's why we have groups of women that enjoy. Doesn't mean that men and women don't like to be together in groups and things. But often, men like to sit with the men and the women like to sit with their friends and talk and schmooze. That's what we do. So, how I want to be sexually by lying with a man, it's telling me if I do that, there's not going to be any pru or vu. This is in the times of the Gemara. There'll be no Jewish children. We'll have no Jewish children. The obligation falls upon the man, not the woman. Not the woman. So if the Torah came out and say, homosexuality is forbidden according to the Torah, I'd have a problem with that today. I'd say maybe they made a mistake. But the Torah doesn't make mistakes. The Torah is the Torah. So I say it said it for a reason of pru or vu, not for a reason against homosexuality. Because if it did, it would have said a woman and a woman can't lie together. I never saw that in the Torah. It says a man and a man. The obligation of pru or vu is on a man, not a woman. And because of that obligation and because of that, it's for me a comforting thought to be able to say, because, by the way, think about the Parsha this week, what it says. It's teaching us to love our neighbor as we would, v'ahavta lireacha kamocha. Love your fellow human being as you love yourself. Not your fellow Jew, everyone. You have to be kind to everybody, whether they're Jewish or they're not Jewish. Although, when we get into the medical ethics, the early Rabbanim said, if it's not a Jew, you don't have to help them. You'll be shocked by that when we get to it. They changed their mind, but you'll understand their methodology. So Rav Moshe Feinstein's saying, there's a later tshuva. He said, a later tshuva which I wrote. So this would have been in the later 1980s. And he explains the halachic understanding. He said, the semen which is produced by a man through masturbation, which will be used as a sample for artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization. That's how they would have done it. It's permissible to perform artificial insemination with that semen. And the scheduling will be when her fertility window will be open. And even though she hasn't gone to the mikvah, that even that's okay, he says. And Rav Moshe Feinstein said it's not prohibited even if she's in the period of nida, even if she's in her menstrual period of that cycle of the month, because there's no act of intercourse. See, the Torah says separation, right? Nida means separation. You know that? So nida is saying you can't be with a woman when she's having her period. But it doesn't say that that's for sexual intercourse. But what about there's no sexual intercourse here? It's in vitro fertilization. So there's no act of intercourse. So therefore, even if she's in her period of nida, she can still have the in vitro fertilization. And guess what he says? He said, with that, the mitzvah of pru urvu has been fulfilled. Wow. Forward thinking for Rav Moshe Feinstein, I think, for him to be able to say, here's a way. We want to create Jews. It's a possibility for her to have a baby. She wants to have a baby. And if she does want to have a baby, then she can have the baby through this way. We won't even allow the laws of nida to come into play. They're going to be completely separate. They'll have nothing to do with it. Well, this is a very critical point, because all of the thinking that we heard from all the older poseks from before, the earlier poskim, they were against it. They said we shouldn't be allowing it. And all of a sudden, Rav Moshe Feinstein comes along and he says, we don't have an act of intercourse here. There is no act of intercourse. Nonetheless, he said Rav Moshe has given credit as though the act of intercourse has occurred, because he said that seed was taken from him and inserted into her. So he's giving a credit for a mitzvah of pru urvu, even though there was no act. That's a very different thinking than the earlier poskim. It's very different for the case of artificial insemination, you know. And he's intending. He said he has an intention of doing this for the purpose of producing a child. So according to the Igros Moshe, which is the book that Moshe Feinstein wrote, in that book, he says in order for him to become the father, he has to do something with the kavanah. Now we've heard about davening with kavanah. It means davening with intention. You should be concentrating on your prayers, not just reciting them like you're saying the phone book. To me, that's the hardest thing. Teaching is easy. Learning about laws is easy. Following laws, sometimes they're easy, sometimes they're not so easy. Davening with kavanah, for me, through my entire life, has been my biggest struggle. I think that's why I wanted to become a chazan, because by being a chazan, you're forced to commit to the obligation that you are a shaliach tzibor leading a congregation. I take that very, very seriously. We had a visiting rabbi from another shul recently, right? And he gave beautiful drashas to us. And he came to me after on Shabbat morning and he said, boy, he said, do you daven like that every week? I said, yes, that's how I daven. That's my style. He said to me, you don't mail it in, do you? I said, I have not mailed it in 22 years at Bet David. There are times where I might be in a hurry, or there are times where I'm sick or I'm not feeling well or I have a bad cold, but I don't believe in mailing it in anything. I believe in preparing. I believe in doing a good job. I believe in taking it seriously. But the kavanah, the intent for prayer, is challenging. It's hard because you're thinking about your children. You're thinking about the bills you have to pay. You're thinking about your old car. Will it start when I get onto the parking lot because the battery was dead yesterday? You're thinking about everything that you have to think about. The health of your friends and your neighbors and your loved ones and your family. But concentrating on the actual tefillot is very difficult. And here's Moshe Feinstein saying that word, kavanah, intent. He's saying you must have the intent. So when you produce that semen, and that semen is being taken to be used for in vitro fertilization because you want to have a child together as a couple, or maybe not even as a couple. that there is a mitzvah being fulfilled. So according to Moshe Feinstein, in order for him to become the father, he has to do something with kavanah. He has to do something with producing this child. And then, because there was kavanah, what happens when you pray with kavanah? We hope that you develop a relationship between yourself and God. I spoke about this last Shabbat. I tried to say, how do we have a relationship with something we can't see or touch or hear? I mean, I talk to God all the time because I'm crazy, but I talk to God and God doesn't answer me. Maybe he answers me and I don't hear him, but it's like a monologue. I'm always talking, you know? And if you have kavanah and you have intent in prayer, or you have kavanah and intent in this act, then there's a halachic relationship between the father and the child. You see, it was produced with kavanah. The act of the in vitro was done with the intent that it might work. And by the way, why does Moshe Feinstein say it's not? There's no guarantee. Lots of people go and have in vitro, and guess what? It doesn't work. Doesn't work over and over and over and over and over, and it never works. And that happens. And that's why it's saying sometimes there's the hand of God. So with that, God is a partner. Now there's a relationship between the father and the child because there was an intent. And this leads to some important conclusions. So some of the important conclusions are, with married couples, in their solution to their fertility problem that they might be having, because otherwise they wouldn't be going for artificial insemination necessarily, then indeed it should be okay and all of the mitzvot apply. And what are all the mitzvot? Well, now he's given the mitzvah, the father of pru or vu. The child, because there was intent and there was kavanah, is given the mitzvah, the commandment of honor your father and your mother, of kabed avicha v'timecha. The father is given the mitzvah of making sure there's an inheritance for the child. You know, it's interesting. When someone dies and you receive an inheritance, often people are sad. They're saying, oh, I wish my grandfather or my mother or my father would live to be another 20 years longer. They should live to be 20 years longer. And they should. But if it's God's way and the person dies and you receive an inheritance, whatever that inheritance be, whether it's $1 or $10,000 or more, you can say a shechianu. Isn't that a weird thing to think about? That you're going to say a shechianu because somebody died? No, you're not saying the shechianu because somebody died. You're saying the shechianu when you receive the inheritance, because that's a mitzvah. You didn't have to get anything. When you get something given to you as a gift like that, it's okay to say a shechianu. Because what is shechianu? It's a bracha of thanksgiving. Now, there are some prohibitions that apply as well. And the prohibitions are of incest. We have to consider that. So if the prohibition of incest comes into play, then we need to find ways to be as careful as possible. And that's why some clinics, and I misquoted, I said Shari Tzedek in Israel, but I recently found out from Rabbi Fink that it's not so halachically like what it was 20 years ago. It was one of the first halachic, maybe it is again, but he said he wasn't so certain that the Shari Tzedek Hospital in Israel is a Torah observant clinic, is the wording he used for it. But there are Torah observant clinics in Israel. And it's worthwhile, if somebody was concerned about that, to go to a Torah observant clinic, because then you know exactly by DNA, by research, by checking and making sure that these issues won't come up. And then we won't have the issue of, I hate the word bastard. I don't like the word. I think it's an awful word. But mamzerim, we'll use that word. I don't even like that word. I think it's an awful word. But things happen, right? Now, I just want to bring in one more pasuk, and then we're going to wrap it up, I think. I mean, I could go on. I'm looking at my notes. I could go on for another 5 weeks on just this topic, but I'm not going to do that to you because you'll be eventually saying I'm crazy. We're going to go on to other things. But the Tzitz Eliezer, I've mentioned them many, many times. So I don't know, I always change my mind when someone said to me, if you could meet one of the rabbis that you could sit and meet, who would you want to meet? Obviously, everybody would say, well, I'd like to meet the Rambam himself, you know what I mean? But those aren't them. If you would have asked me this 5 years ago, I probably would have said Rav Moshe Feinstein. You know, I would have been fascinated to have been in his presence. I never had that opportunity. But I would say Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who I also didn't meet. He lived in Israel, wonderful, brilliant thinking rabbi, Haredi, but yet found leniencies and had such compassion for people that he would look for ways to be compassionate to make things work for people. I love learning Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's opinions, especially when we learned them through the beginning parts of technology. By the way, you know, Lily, so my daughter here, she's taking Rabbi Kelman's class in chat of Halacha. And he gave them a big list of all these rabbanim that you can pick through. You have to give a presentation in front of the class on one of the rabbis. And she hears me talking all the time about halacha, so she's thinking she's going to take Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, who the other rabbi I would have loved to have met is Tzitz Eliezer, because also extremely lenient on different issues. And I said, no, I said, I think I would pick the Chazon Ish, Rav Karelitz, or I would pick Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, because they were very forward in their thinking. First of all, without Shlomo Zalman, we wouldn't be able to have the leniencies today for the opinions that we have on electricity, on Shabbat, the use of electricity the way we do. For instance, timers. Timers are a wonderful advancement, and they could have said, you know, you can't use it, it's not Shabbos day. The people don't do it. But because the people want it so badly, we found ways to use it in leniencies such as lights. And now in Israel, not so much in North America yet, but it's coming, the leniency of setting your timers for dishwashers on Shabbat. In Israel, everybody's dishwasher is going off on Shabbat. They're using them like crazy. But it's funny here. In North America, we're slower than they are there on many issues, including kitniyot. Kitniyot is a very interesting thing. In Israel, it seems everybody's eating kitniyot. And here people are going, my father didn't eat it, my grandfather didn't eat it, so I'm not going to eat it. I think I'm also ready to give it up. But who was the Tzitz Eliezer? He was Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg. And he died in 2006, but he was the rabbi. Today it's the Minchas Asher, I think. The Minchas Asher is Asher Weiss. Another brilliant. By the way, if you go on to YouTube and you look up Rav Asher Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, he gives Dvar Torahs. You can listen to him. It's unbelievable. He's a brilliant, he can pull from every source of the Gemara. He can tell you, I think it's on page Lamed Hey, the second side, about 7 lines from the bottom, the third word in. Like, he knows it off by heart. But the thing about Rav Asher Weiss is he's not so happy with the state of Israel being a state, and I have a big problem with that because I'm extremely Zionistic, well, as we all probably are, and so I struggle with that with him, but yet he's brilliant. So Eliezer Waldenberg was born in Israel. So he was born in Jerusalem in 1915 to Rabbi Yaakov Gedalia, who came from Lithuania. So they came to Lithuania and they lived in Israel before it was even called Israel, when it was the pre-mandatory called Palestine. And he would teach courses in medical ethics, and he became a posek, an authority on medical ethics, and worked at the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. And he was a great friend to Rav Shalom Eliashiv. Anyway, so he died. He had a major work. He was an encyclopedia. He was a walking encyclopedia on medical ethics. So we'll get to him often through the next series of courses, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he says that with artificial insemination, he says it very graphically and very plainly. So I'm going to share exactly his words. He says the seed is inserted vaginally and therefore it's producing a pregnancy in the complete normal way. It's natural. Because of some medical problem that the husband and the wife have, we do everything we can to help them. And by helping them, otherwise it would be a complete normal way of fertilizing an egg. He said the seed is injected into her womb and afterwards it's been inseminated and afterwards there's a pregnancy, and all of this is true in artificial insemination. But then he said, but it's not necessarily true with in vitro fertilization. He said with in vitro, it takes place in a laboratory. It's a little bit separate. It's not inserted, so he's questioning the mitzvah. He says, so the fabric of nature, the way things work naturally, it's being changed when we engage in vitro because it's being done in a lab. So he says that man's semen is not being injected right into the womb, and therefore there wasn't even, he said, ovulation. So he says here, her eggs were harvested through surgery. The semen that fertilized the egg was done in a laboratory, and the egg was later on removed and is taken to a lab, and she isn't even there, she's not even in the room, she's not even present, and that's where the fertilization takes place. And he goes through all of the issues, but then when he comes to at the end, he says, since the pregnancy through the in vitro has a third party, which is the laboratory workers, involved in fertilizing the egg, there really, he said, is there a relationship between the man and the woman? Is there a relationship between the man and the woman? Because it's being done in a lab. He said there is plenty of room to say that everyone should agree that he is not performing the mitzvah of pru or vu. He's saying maybe he doesn't get the mitzvah of saying he was fruitful and multiplying. So according to the Tzitz Eliezer, he said, and this is because he was a compassionate person. He's giving the thinking, he's giving the logic, but he doesn't want to come to the line and say, it doesn't count. Because that's not nice. We're supposed to be nice too, right? So what he says is, he says, so we'll be neutral when it comes to say that we wouldn't necessarily encourage in vitro fertilization. But there is also no mitzvah in doing it. However, in the case, he said all the other mitzvot should be in place. Kabed av va'em, honoring your mother and your father, all the other mitzvot come into place. Well, by taking a neutral stand, because these guys are Haredi. I mean, they're wearing big hats and they have long beards, right? So they're going to take a much more strict opinion than any of us in this room. But you know what? They're trying to be as compassionate and as possible. Now, this tshuva that I just said to you from the Tzitz Eliezer, from Rav Eliezer Yehuda of Oldenburg, it came as a response. He wouldn't have even said it. He didn't even want to bring it up. It was a response because, you know, we always say these, they're always being written to. Here's a letter, respond to me, I have a question, Rabbi. So Avigdor Nebenzahl, a great Rav, he's the Rav of the Jewish quarter in the Old City today, and one of the leading Talmidim. He was one of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's leading students. So he's an important pasuk himself. So he says, as far as in vitro fertilization is concerned, he sees not the mitzvah of pru or vu, of being fruitful and multiplying, and he feels that the man is not even halachically the father. But that's what the Tzitz Eliezer, he says, taught us. Is that true? So he says, in my humble opinion, Rav Avigdor Nebenzahl, pregnancy which results from fertilization in the laboratory, he said, you know what? It's natural. It's very natural. Sperm fertilizes the egg. That's what happens in nature. It happens in nature, whether it happens in a petri dish or whether it happens in the womb. It's natural. That's what happens. And it doesn't matter what led to the sperm being fertilized. It doesn't matter that the sperm fertilized the ovum. He said it doesn't matter. He says those are the laws of nature. And biology, Bernie, are you listening? You're going to love this one. He says, biology is the same as any other act of fertilization. He said that's perfectly natural, and Rav Nebenzahl holds that there is no difference between artificial insemination. This is Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's leading Talmud. In vitro, artificial insemination, it's all the same. And he says, now you can be happy, okay, because we always want to end on something good. The mitzvah of Puravu does apply. Yay! Okay, so we even get all the mitzvahs, we can crap. Now, I'm not going to tell you what Rav Yaakov Ariel said. He was the chief rabbi of Ramat Gan. He was also a leading posek, and he was completely against everything. But that's not what we follow. What we follow is that all of the mitzvot that we talked about come into place. They all come into place, and there was kavanah, there was intent. Even if it's done in a lab, even if it's in vitro, it's still done with an intent of fulfilling all of the mitzvot. So I think we end this topic on a satisfactory note. Not everything in Halacha ends that way. Some things end in a way that we're not happy with. And then we have to make our own decisions. We have to look for alternatives and find ways to make things so we can live a happy life. But some things end up at the end of the day that the Rabbanim come together and the opinions collide in a happy way and mesh together to give us a nice approach. So I hope that that satisfies most of you on the topic. Are there any questions before we go on? Does anybody have a question?
I have a question. What about surrogacy?
Surrogacy?
Mm-hmm.
It's 100% the same thing. Surrogacy would be, I believe, I got to check and I'm going to come to you with the right answer. But when I look at it, I think what happens is the only question is whether or not there's a mitzvah of pru'ervu, because there's a kavanah, there's an intent at the beginning of the process. There's an intent. The intent is to produce a child. So if it's being produced and being fertilized by this person is giving semen, to be fertilizing an egg in this person's womb, then it's being done for the purpose of having the baby for this mother. Would the poskim promote it? Probably not. Would they allow it at the end of the day? 100%. Because you know what it is? At the end of the day, it's really adoption, isn't it, in a sense? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Please, I'm not a genius. I'm just Marshall. But when I look at it, I say, if somebody has a baby and I'm raising that baby, it's in a form of adoption. I always use myself as an example because I'm the father of 3 children. I've produced none. But I'm dad to 3 children. And do I accept the halachic responsibility to raise them and to help them and to pay for them and to give them inheritances? Do they call me their father? Yes. So I'm I look at it as, did I perform the mitzvah of pru'ervu ever in my life? 100% not. I don't have that mitzvah. I never had that mitzvah. Am I sad about it? No, because I've raised 3 children. You know, to me, the biggest mitzvah is finally seeing them leave the house and go to university. Because it means they're starting to fly on their own. It means that they're starting to do for themselves. They can grow up. You never think they're ever going to get to that. And then they call you with the big problems that they have, like from university. Tristan called today from Ottawa. It's a big problem. One of the roommates moved out and he got cut off from his internet today. So call the internet company and get the internet back on. If that's the biggest problem that they're going to have, halavai, that should be, So I think raising children is really what is the halachic responsibility. Would it have been nice to have had children? I suppose 100% it would have been nice to have had that mitzvah.
Right.
Am I sad about it in my life? No. So I'm very pleased. But I find this topic as being part of technology that was taught by Rabbi Fink, a fascinating thing that he brought into technology. I didn't have to take the medical ethics course. I took it because he's such a good teacher, and that is where he shines, because he is he's a posek in medical ethics. So when I'm sharing notes from him or footnotes, you can take his course. It's $400. You go online, or you can sit with me and do. I'm not him, but I'm sharing what I'm learning from him with you. His courses are phenomenal, and as I continue to learn, because I'm in my 6th course, I'm completing. You know, to get a mastery in halacha, you have to do 6 courses, and you have to pass 6 courses, and midterms and finals. So what I've done is I've done kashrut, and then I did a course I'm doing now on Shabbat and kashrut, and medical ethics, and technology, and then I'll go back and do a different course in technology, and then we'll do another course in Moed. I want to do the festivals and the holidays, and as I learn, I'll share what I learned with you, and it's like you'll go to yeshiva with me together. We'll go through this in the next couple of years, maybe, or you'll say to me, "I've had enough. I don't want to learn anymore." But either way, I'm putting away this binder. There's my binder of notes on medical ethics. You're free to borrow it. You're free to take it home. You're free to read it. You'll see all the sources. It's all there for you. I share with anybody. And now I'm going to put away this binder till later. David has a question.
I'm leaving. I must go. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I apologize to everyone.
I know you had to go earlier. So Yom Tov, you'll catch up with me. I'll catch you up on this. All right. I'm just giving you an introduction. So in medical ethics, there are some topics that are very controversial. We're learning right now about the U.S. that wants to turn over Roe versus Wade. Terrible. So it's very. I don't want to get political. You know how I feel about it. How do I feel about it? I think it's terrible. It's awful. First of all, I think that what right does someone have to say to somebody else what they should be doing with their own body? Number one, and secondly, I do have my own opinions about to what extent, to what term. Meaning, if somebody's, I'll give an example, 5 months pregnant and they decide they want to have an abortion, I think that there should be laws and rules. Am I right, Noreen? Right. But there needs to be sensitivity, and I don't think it should be the core. I think it's awful. Anyway, so I'm with you on that. So here are the topics that I was wanting to discuss. And then you might say, you know what, I don't want to be part of that part of it, and you can skip those classes. And you can come back later and join us later on. The topics that I want to talk about are the laws, the halacha, the leniencies, the stringencies, and what we actually follow, the paskening of today, what we actually are allowed to follow. And then we'll be open for discussion about what you would like to follow. So I'm not telling you what you should do. I'm telling you what the rabbi said, because it's very in-depth, and if you had to go and research this yourself, it's going to take a long, long time. So if I just share it with you through the sources, it'll be faster. I want to talk about induced abortion. I think it's a very interesting topic. You might say, I don't want to come to that. Is it halachically allowed? I want to talk about transgender surgery. I think that it's a very big topic today, and I want to see what the poskim say on it. And I want to talk about what do you do when you have a sick person on Shabbat? What goes out the window? What can we do? What can't we do? Why should we do it? And why did they say that we're allowed to do it? I want to talk about the obligation to heal. Is there an obligation to heal somebody? When I say heal, I use that term because the Gemara didn't talk about doctors. They didn't use the word physician. They used the word healer. They used the word healer because that's what you were. You were someone who maybe found herbs, or you knew of what's the term, Bernie? Organic chemistry. They understood something about organic chemistry to make the right combinations of medicines. What was allowed on Shabbat? What was not allowed on Shabbat? And why? And forget about Shabbat, but just in general, is there a prohibition or is there encouragement to heal somebody if they don't want to be healed? How about that topic? Sometimes people don't want anymore. Homeopathy. We're going to get that. Thank you for that. So we're going to talk about sick people on Shabbat and what do we do? And then I want to talk about doubtful threats to life. Somebody says every 5 minutes, I'm having a heart attack. I think I'm having a heart attack, but they're not having a heart attack. They're having gas. They ate too much, you know, or they swallowed air, or they drank their soda too fast, you know. But they're a hypochondriac. But nevertheless, there could be a doubtful threat to this person's life. So I want to talk about that. And then at the end, it's fascinating. We'll finish off with alternative medicine. Alternative medicine is unbelievable, and the sources are unbelievable because this is not a new concept. We think of alternative medicine as being what Reiki, chiropractors, massage therapists, wearing garlic around your neck, a magnet around your wrist. Everybody's got something, right? So in the Gemara, there was plenty of alternative medicine, and some of it bordered on mysticism. Some of it bordered on what they believed were supernatural spirits that were coming to do things. Are we allowed to go to somebody who doesn't believe in God, believes in the supernatural spirits, to get healed if we believe that person can heal us? Does the Torah, does the Gemara, does the Shulchan Aruch, does Rav Moshe Feinstein, do they allow us to go and see a person who is going to wave their hands over our body and the spirits from above will help me and speak through my hands and make you feel better? Does the Torah allow that? You'll be very surprised at what the Torah allows, or what the Gemara allows. I think you'll be very happy at the end of all of it, and you'll say, oh, thank God there's so many leniencies for all of these practices. So if we were to start, is it okay if I talk about induced abortion, or is that going to upset anybody? Because I give you a chance to not participate in a class. I'm not a doctor. You got Isaac here. Isaac will correct me and keep me on the right path if I say anything. He said, I disagree. Oh, direct message. I disagree. You produce and sustain those 3 children each and every day. To my mind, that's puravu. Even if he dur and proravu yishikocha. All right. Very nice. Beautiful words. So I think that please email me privately. Please send me messages. Do it publicly. When you don't agree with something I'm saying, send it in the general chat to everybody so they can read it. It doesn't have to be private. Marshall, you're full of it. I don't believe it. I'm happy to read it. That's okay. I don't mind. I won't be insulted. I'm just telling you what the rabbi said, and then we'll take it from there. You know, we're going to just begin with this idea of abortion with, before we wrap it up, we have 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes or so. One time I went a half an hour too long. Remember that, Faye? I went a half an hour too long. In Parshat Shmot, because we always have to go to the Torah before we go to the Talmud, right? In Parshat Shmot, in the second book of the Torah, there's a story. 2 men are fighting with each other. They're having a battle. And what happens? There's an innocent person, a bystander, and a pregnant woman. And one of the men accidentally delivers a blow to her. One of the men accidentally hits her. And the blow to her body caused the children to come out. What does that mean? She's pregnant. Doesn't say what happened. He hit her and it caused the children to come out. What does that mean, the children to come out? It's an abortion. He hit her. He caused an abortion. If the children come out and they weren't ready to come out, he caused an abortion. But it wasn't so disastrous. How can anybody say it wasn't so disastrous? The guilty man who delivered the blow must be punished. Will have to pay the woman's husband. The payment has to be made in the court of law, and the rabbis will have to decide how much he will have to pay. This is only true if he hits her but causes no disaster. On the other hand, it's a disastrous event. So if it's a disastrous event, then it becomes a capital crime and the death penalty is imposed. This teaches us that there are two kinds of abortion. There's a more serious kind and there's a less serious kind. In the less serious kind, which is not a disaster, it becomes a financial matter. He has to pay retribution. If it's more serious, then the death penalty is imposed. So the disaster that we are referring to depends on something. It depends on whether or not there was a death involved. If there was a death involved, then we don't take this literally when we say a life for a life, by the way. You know that, right? We say those terms, but we don't necessarily take it so literally. But if there was death involved, then that law would come into place. A life for a life. The verse is silent on who died in this case. So, did the woman die because the children came out? Did the mother die? Did the children die? Probably. Doesn't say. It's going to become an interesting case because what's going to happen is we're going to go through this same story again next week. But we're going to hear the story told differently by a few different scholars. And then we're going to find out that up until a certain point, which is where we're going, a child inside of a mother, according to the Talmud, is the same as having a hand or a wrist, a finger, a leg. It's an appendage. It's part of your body. It's like an organ. You got a liver, you have a kidney, you have a pancreas, you have a heart, you have a baby in there. But the baby isn't out, so it's part of your body. So it's an awful story, but according to this story, if he kicked her by accident, not on purpose, chas v'chalila, and he caused her to lose her baby because he kicked her, and she loses the baby, it's a tragedy in my opinion. But is he going to be put to death if she doesn't die, if the mother doesn't die? Because if I cut off her leg accidentally, I'm cutting a tree down with a chainsaw. And the chainsaw slips because I got startled by a big dog that came by, and I went like this and I cut her finger off, her leg off, her arm off. Do I get put to death because I accidentally cut her leg off with the chainsaw? It's a tragedy. I cut her leg off with a chainsaw. I didn't do it intentionally. I was cutting a tree down. I might have to pay retribution. I might have to pay for her to have an artificial limb. treatment, hospitalization, medical care. Her family will have to eat. I'll be responsible for all those things, but I won't be responsible for being put to death to that level. So we're going to talk about what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and what the poskim saying. Next week, we're going to bring up Rashi, and we're going to bring up the Mishnah and the Gemara and Rambam, 12th, 13th century, the old poskim. We're going to see what they say on this matter. And then the following week, we'll take a look and we'll see what Rav Moshe Feinstein and the later authorities say. So I'll try and do it not too long. I don't want to schlep it out in too many weeks, this topic, but we'll move from here. It's very interesting, by the way. It's very fascinating. And we'll go through it, and then after that, we'll come to the next topic. We're going to get to all of them. Assisted suicide is a fascinating topic as well. We'll go through that, and then we'll hear what the experts in the room here have to say. So thank you for sharing time with me, and let's get together again next week.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you, Marshall.
everybody.
Very interesting. Thank you.